I walked into the kitchen holding the promotion letter, still smiling. Director of Operations. Everything I'd worked for. Daniel stood by the counter, arms crossed, face blank. I expected excitement, maybe pride. Instead, he said the words that split everything in half. This promotion has changed you. My smile froze. He continued, calm and cold, explaining he was separating our finances effective immediately. While I stood there trying to understand, he pulled out his phone and transferred his portion of our shared account into a new one I couldn't access. The kitchen felt smaller. My hands shook holding that letter. I asked him why. He looked at me like I should already know. You'll understand eventually, he said, then walked out. I stood there alone, promotion letter in one hand, marriage crumbling in the other. The celebration I'd imagined turned into silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his face, searching for the husband I knew. He was gone. The next morning, Daniel laid out new rules over coffee like he was chairing a business meeting. Separate accounts. Split bills 50-50. No discussion about purchases over $50 unless they affected shared space. He called it fairness, a way to respect my independence now that I was successful. But his tone told a different story. This wasn't about respect. It was about control slipping through his fingers and him grabbing for it anywhere he could. I listened without interrupting, watching him justify dismantling our partnership with spreadsheet logic. When he finished, he asked if I understood. I nodded, though understanding and agreeing weren't the same thing. He seemed satisfied, like he'd solved a problem. I felt something crack inside that I couldn't name yet. That afternoon, I sat in my new office at work, staring at my title on the door: director, leader, success. Yet at home, I'd been demoted to roommate. The irony burned.
The first shared bill arrived 3 days later. Rent, I transferred my half immediately, like always. Then I waited for Daniel's portion. Hours passed, nothing. I checked again the next morning. Still nothing. By evening, I had to cover the full amount to avoid late fees. I paid it, stomach tight with anger I didn't express. When Daniel came home, I mentioned it casually. He shrugged, said he forgot, promised he'd get me back. But something in his tone suggested he expected this outcome, like testing whether I'd actually enforce the boundaries he'd created, or quietly absorb the gap like I'd always absorbed his moods, his insecurities, his silences. I documented the payment in a notebook I'd started keeping: date, amount, his promise to repay. It felt cold, transactional, but if he wanted separation, I'd give him clarity. That night, I realized something. He wanted independence without accountability, and I'd been providing exactly that for years. 2 weeks later, we attended a small dinner party at his colleague's house. I wore the confidence my promotion gave me, spoke about upcoming projects when asked. Daniel sat beside me, smiling, nodding, playing the supportive husband. Then, during dessert, he made a joke. "Amara's married to her job now," he said, laughing. "I'm basically a corporate widow." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, reflexively, though the words landed like stones in my chest. He framed my success as abandonment, my ambition as neglect, my growth as betrayal. And he did it with charm, so no one questioned it. I smiled wider, swallowed the humiliation, finished my wine. But something hardened inside me that night. A coworker from my company, Vanessa, was there too. She caught my eye across the table, her expression unreadable. Later, by the coats, she leaned in close. Her next words would stay with me for weeks. Vanessa's voice was quiet, careful. "Sometimes success exposes things love was hiding." She didn't explain further, just squeezed my arm and left. I stood there holding my coat, her words circling my mind like a warning I wasn't ready to hear. That night, I lay awake beside Daniel, watching him sleep peacefully while I pieced together moments I'd ignored. The subtle dismissals, the jokes that weren't really jokes, the way he'd stopped asking about my day once my title changed. Love hadn't hidden these things. I'd wrapped them in excuses, convinced myself he'd adjust. That marriage meant patience, but patience had become endurance, and endurance was turning into erasure. The next morning, Daniel surprised me. Over breakfast, he asked if I could help him with something. His tone was lighter, almost apologetic. I waited, guarded. He needed money for a car repair, unexpected and urgent. Just this once, he said. I stared at him, recognizing the pattern. Separation when it suited him. Partnership when he needed something. Daniel explained the car situation with detail designed to justify the request. The mechanic required payment upfront. His account was tight this month. He'd pay me back by Friday, promise. I listened, watching him perform concern while expecting rescue. This was the contradiction I'd been living. He wanted financial independence from me, except when my money solved his problems. Then suddenly we were partners again, temporary, conditional, convenient. I felt the manipulation, clear as glass, but I didn't argue. Instead, I agreed. His face relaxed immediately, relief washing over him. But before he could thank me, I added my condition. I'd transfer the money, but I needed it back by Friday, documented, in writing if necessary. His relief faltered. He looked confused, almost hurt. You don't trust me? He asked. I met his eyes. You wanted separate finances, I said calmly. This is what that looks like. He didn't respond. The money transferred. The boundary held. I added the car repair payment to my notebook. Date, amount, repayment deadline. Friday. It felt clinical, unromantic, everything a marriage shouldn't be. But he'd built this structure, not me. I was just refusing to be crushed by it. At work that week, I thrived. My team respected me. Projects moved forward. My opinions mattered. At home, I documented expenses, tracked promises, protected myself. It was the first time I'd created space for my own dignity inside my marriage. Friday came. Daniel's repayment didn't. By evening, I mentioned it. He looked surprised, said he'd forgotten, asked if next week was okay. I said no. He stiffened. I explained calmly that I'd covered rent alone, paid his car repair, absorbed the gap he created while he enjoyed the independence he demanded. He could pay me back now, or we'd revisit what separate finances actually meant. Something shifted in his face. He saw me differently. Not the accommodating wife, someone else. Someone who wouldn't disappear quietly. He transferred the money that night, silently, resentfully, but he paid. The tension grew slowly, filling rooms before we entered them. Daniel started calling me cold, calculating, distant. He said I'd changed, that success had hardened me, that I wasn't the woman he married. I listened to these accusations, searching for truth in them. Had I changed? Yes, but not the way he meant. I'd stopped shrinking, stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped pretending his discomfort was my emergency. He missed the version of me that managed his emotions, anticipated his needs, absorbed his fears without naming them. He called that love. I called it exhaustion. One evening, he asked what happened to us. I almost laughed. Nothing happened. Everything was just finally visible. The roles I'd played were costumes I'd removed, and without them, he couldn't recognize me. A letter arrived in the mail the next day, certified, official. I opened it while Daniel was at work. My stomach dropped as I read. I opened it while Daniel was at work. My stomach dropped as I read. A shared financial obligation, one we'd both signed for. Due in 10 days. Daniel had assumed I'd handle it. He always did. The letter outlined a payment for a loan we'd consigned to years ago, back when finances were truly shared, when partnership wasn't a weapon. The amount was significant. Due on Sunday. I read it twice, then checked our agreement. The loan responsibility had never been discussed during Daniel's separation announcement. He'd simply assumed I'd manage it like I managed everything else that required follow-through. I could have called him immediately, reminded him, solved it preemptively like I'd always done. Instead, I placed the letter on the kitchen counter where he'd see it eventually and went about my week. I didn't mention it, didn't remind him, didn't manage his responsibility. For the first time, I let consequences arrive without a buffer. At work, I led meetings, made decisions, earned my title. At home, I watched Daniel move through the week oblivious, confident in the safety net he'd rejected but still expected. Sunday approached, the deadline loomed, and I stayed quiet, Sunday morning arrived calm and bright. Daniel made coffee, scrolled through his phone, moved through the house with easy confidence. I watched him, wondering when he'd notice the letter still sitting on the counter. He didn't. By noon, I mentioned casually that today was the deadline for the Kazine loan. He looked up, confused. What loan? I pointed to the letter. His face changed as he read it, panic replacing comfort. Why didn't you remind me earlier? He asked, voice rising. I stayed calm. Separate finances, I said. You wanted independence. This is yours to manage. He stared at me like I'd broken an unspoken rule, violated some invisible contract where I protected him from himself. But that contract had been terminated by him 2 weeks ago. In this kitchen, he started calculating frantically, checking his account, realizing he didn't have enough to cover it alone. The payment was due by 4 hours. His confidence crumbled. I sipped my coffee, watching the power shift happen in real time. Subtle, irreversible, necessary. Daniel's panic was new. I'd never seen him scramble before, never watched him face a consequence he couldn't charm or dismiss his way out of. He called the lender, asking for extensions, denied. He checked his account again like the numbers might change. They didn't. Finally, he turned to me. Can you help? His voice was different now, smaller. I looked at him carefully, measuring my words. I could help. I had the money, but helping meant rewinding to a dynamic where I rescued him from decisions he made about us without including me. I asked him a question instead. Do you understand what you've been asking of me? He blinked, confused. I continued. You separated our finances to punish my success, then expected me to still cover the gaps, manage the responsibilities, carry the weight. You wanted independence and partnership simultaneously, depending on what benefited you. He started to argue, then stopped. The truth was too clear. For the first time in weeks, Daniel had no response, just silence and listening. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I explained, clearly and calmly, what his decision had cost me emotionally. The humiliation of being cut off after achieving something I'd worked years for. The loneliness of paying bills alone while being called cold for expecting reciprocity. The exhaustion of managing his insecurities while building my career. He sat across from me, face shifting through defensiveness to something softer, listening, actually listening. When I finished, he said quietly, I didn't know you felt this way. I almost laughed. He didn't know because he hadn't asked. He'd assumed, decided, announced. I asked him why he really separated the finances. He hesitated, walls crumbling. Finally, he admitted the truth. My promotion made him feel small, afraid, replaceable. Instead of talking about it, he tried to regain control the only way he knew how. By diminishing me financially, he thought he'd feel bigger. It hadn't worked. I looked at him, seeing clearly now. His insecurity, my silence, the collision that almost destroyed us. That night, I replayed our history differently. Moments I'd dismissed suddenly stood out sharp and clear. When I'd shared excitement about a work project and he'd changed the subject. When I'd celebrated a smaller promotion and he'd made it about timing, luck, anything but my effort. When I'd suggested ideas and he'd explained why they wouldn't work before I finished speaking. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. A slow erosion I'd normalized as marriage, as compromise, as love requiring sacrifice. But sacrifice had become one-sided. My dreams got smaller so his ego could stay comfortable. My voice got quieter so his felt louder. I'd been disappearing incrementally, and the promotion had simply made the absence visible. Daniel admitted something else that night. He'd been jealous, not proud, jealous. When I succeeded, he felt like he was failing.
Over the next few days, I explained what partnership actually meant now. Not what it used to be, back when I was smaller and he was comfortable. What it needed to be moving forward. Respect for my career without resentment. Celebration of my wins without making them about his insecurity. Financial transparency and shared responsibility, not conditional collaboration. Autonomy without isolation. Space without abandonment. He listened, taking notes like I was presenting a proposal. Maybe I was. A proposal for a marriage worth keeping. I also explained what I needed emotionally. Apologies that led to change. Conversations instead of assumptions. Curiosity about my life instead of jokes that diminished it. He looked overwhelmed. I understood. I was asking him to dismantle patterns he'd built over years. Maybe his whole life. But growth was uncomfortable. And I was done shrinking to make his stagnation easier. I gave him a choice. Not an ultimatum. A choice. He could do the work, or we could part respectfully. But the version of our marriage where I managed his emotions while sacrificing my dignity was over. He asked for time. I gave him a week. That week, I established boundaries without threats. Just reality. I explained clearly what I would and wouldn't accept moving forward. I wouldn't tolerate public humiliation disguised as jokes. Wouldn't cover his financial gaps while being blamed for independence. Wouldn't apologize for success or shrink to make him comfortable. These weren't punishments. They were standards. He could meet them or choose not to. But I wouldn't negotiate my dignity anymore. I also explained consequences. Not to scare him. To clarify. If he continued patterns that disrespected me, I'd protect myself. Financially. Emotionally. Legally if necessary. I wasn't interested in divorce. But I was less interested in erasure. He seemed shaken by my clarity. The woman he'd tried to control was setting terms. Now. Calmly. Firmly. Without anger but without flexibility. That week. I watched him think. Process. Struggle. I didn't help him through it. Didn't manage his discomfort or ease his path. He needed to sit with the cost of his choices. Feel what almost breaking us felt like. Decide if keeping me was worth changing for. By the end of the week, something shifted. Small, but visible. Daniel started changing behaviors quietly. No announcements. No fanfare. Just actions. He paid his half of the bills on time. Transferred money without reminders. Asked about my day and actually listened to the answers. At dinner, he mentioned something I'd told him a week ago, proving he'd been paying attention. Small things, but consistent. I didn't rush forgiveness. Didn't praise him for doing what should have been standard. I watched, waited, measured his follow-through against his promises. Weeks passed. The changes continued. He started researching therapy, asked if I'd consider couples counseling. I said I'd think about it. He didn't push. One evening, he apologized again. But this time it was different. No excuses. No justifications. Just accountability. He said he'd been wrong. Selfish. Cruel in ways he hadn't wanted to admit. He'd punished me for succeeding because watching me grow forced him to confront his own stagnation. That was his issue. Not mine. And he'd made me carry it. I believed him this time. Not because the words were prettier, but because his actions had already started proving them true. Daniel's apology landed differently because it came with evidence. Changed behavior. Sustained effort. Humility. He wasn't performing remorse. To get back into my good graces. He was genuinely reckoning with who he'd been and who he needed to become. I told him I appreciated the apology. And I did. But appreciation wasn't absolution. Trust rebuilt slowly. Through consistency. Through proving that discomfort wouldn't make him retreat into old patterns. He understood. Didn't rush me. One afternoon, I made a request. A final test, though I didn't frame it that way. We were invited to another dinner party. Same group. Same setting where he'd humiliated me weeks ago. I asked him to come. And to correct the narrative he'd created. He looked nervous. But he agreed. The night of the party, I wore confidence like armor. Daniel stayed close, attentive. When the conversation turned to work, Someone made a joke about corporate life consuming souls. Daniel responded before I could. He said I'd been promoted recently. That he was proud. That watching me lead had taught him about strength. The room paused. I paused. It was public. Honest. A correction. And it mattered. Daniel's words at the party shifted something fundamental. He didn't just stop diminishing me. He actively celebrated me. In front of people who'd heard him mock my ambition weeks earlier. It wasn't performative. It was intentional. A public apology without calling it one. Later, someone asked how he felt about my success. He answered carefully. Said he'd struggled initially. That insecurity had made him small. But that he was learning to grow alongside me instead of resenting the space I took up. It was vulnerable. Real. I watched him choose honesty over ego. And something unexpected happened. I felt proud of him. Not for celebrating me, that should have been baseline. But for admitting his struggle publicly. For choosing growth over comfort. For doing the hard work without guarantees I'd stay. On the drive home, I told him I noticed the change. He didn't deflect or minimize. Just said he was trying. That I deserved better than who he'd been. And he wanted to become someone worth keeping. I reached for his hand. First time in weeks. He held it carefully. Like something fragile. Something he'd almost lost. Over the following weeks, I realized something unexpected. The power I'd reclaimed didn't come from punishing Daniel. It came from respecting myself enough to demand better. Revenge hadn't been about making him suffer. It was about refusing to disappear. I'd spent months absorbing his insecurity, managing his emotions, making myself smaller so he'd feel bigger. And when I stopped, when I set boundaries and enforced consequences, the marriage didn't end. It transformed. Daniel was changing. Slowly. Imperfectly. But genuinely. And I was changing too. Not becoming harder or colder like he'd accused. Becoming clearer. More certain of my worth. Less willing to negotiate my dignity for peace. I thought about how close I'd come to losing myself. How quietly it had happened. How I'd normalized disrespect, dismissed red flags. Convinced myself that marriage meant endurance. But partnership wasn't supposed to hurt this way. And success wasn't supposed to threaten love. Real love grew alongside you. Celebrated you. Made space for both people to be whole. I was learning that now. And so was Daniel. I started prioritizing my career and well-being unapologetically. Took on projects that excited me. Said yes to opportunities without checking if they'd threaten Daniel's comfort. Invested in myself financially, emotionally, professionally. For the first time in years, I wasn't apologizing for taking up space. And Daniel responded differently than before. Instead of resentment, he showed support. Asked about my projects. Celebrated my wins genuinely. Encouraged me to pursue goals even when they required sacrifice from both of us. The shift was remarkable. Not just in him. In me. I'd been so afraid that success would cost me my marriage. But shrinking had almost cost me myself. Now I understood. If my growth threatened us, the relationship was already broken. Real partnership expanded with you. It didn't demand you stay small to survive. Daniel started working on himself too. Therapy. Personal goals. Hobbies he'd abandoned. He stopped defining himself through my failures or successes and started building his own identity. We were becoming individuals again. Not enmeshed. Not codependent. Just two whole people choosing each other daily. It was healthier. Harder. Better. We renegotiated finances together this time. Not through control or separation. Through transparency. We created a system that respected both autonomy and partnership. Separate accounts for personal spending. Shared account for household expenses. Funded equally and fairly. Open conversations about goals, purchases, investments. It felt adult. Respectful. Nothing like the punishment Daniel had implemented weeks ago. He apologized again for how he'd handled it initially. For weaponizing independence. For trying to diminish me financially when he felt threatened. I accepted the apology. And I forgave him. Not because time had passed, but because his actions had earned it. We also established new communication patterns. Weekly check-ins about finances, emotions, goals, space to voice discomfort before it became resentment, permission to struggle without making it the other person's fault. It required vulnerability from both of us. Daniel had to admit insecurity without expecting me to fix it. I had to express needs without softening them to protect his feelings. It was messy sometimes, but honest. And honesty was building something stronger than what we'd had before. Another Sunday arrived, months after the one that changed everything. This time, the morning felt different, calmer, intentional, equal. Daniel made breakfast. We reviewed bills together, splitting costs fairly, transferring money without tension. He asked about my week ahead. I asked about his. We existed as partners, not opponents, not manager and managed, just two people building a life. I noticed the contrast. That earlier Sunday, he'd been confident I'd rescue him from consequences he'd ignored. Today, he took responsibility without prompting. That earlier Sunday, I'd been invisible in my own marriage. Today, I was seen, respected, celebrated. The promotion hadn't changed me. It had revealed who truly supported my growth. And Daniel had to decide which side he was on. He'd chosen growth. Slowly, painfully, but genuinely. I wondered sometimes if the change would last, if insecurity would creep back during my next success, if he'd revert to old patterns when discomfort returned. I didn't know, but I knew I'd never shrink again, never manage his emotions at the cost of mine, never apologize for being whole. I smiled, sipping coffee, watching morning light fill the kitchen. Something had shifted. Truly. Finally. Looking back now, I understand what really happened. The promotion didn't change me. It revealed the cracks love had been hiding. My success forced Daniel to confront his stagnation. My confidence exposed his insecurity. My growth highlighted the space where partnership should have been. He responded by trying to control what he couldn't compete with. And I responded by refusing to disappear. The revenge wasn't elaborate. It was simple. I stopped absorbing his dysfunction, stopped managing consequences that weren't mine, stopped shrinking so he'd feel bigger. And when I stood tall, he had two choices: grow alongside me or watch me outgrow him. He chose growth. Not immediately, not perfectly, but eventually. And that choice saved us. But here's what I learned. Marriage isn't about enduring mistreatment until someone decides to respect you. It's about knowing your worth clearly enough to demand better from the beginning. The promotion gave me financial power, but self-respect gave me everything else. Now when people ask if success changed me, I smile. Yes, it did. It changed me back into the person I was before I learned to make myself small. And that person wasn't disposable. She never was. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you.